Hello, everyone. We are very excited that you guys are joining with us this evening for our actual third program that we have for our virtual Cut Flower short course. And I know that you all are really excited. I do want to say a couple of little things before we actually get started. My name is Kristen Hildebrand. I'm the Horticulture Extension Agent here in Bowling Green. I'm one of the organizers for tonight's event, and you'll hear some of the other committee members going to be introducing themselves throughout the night as well. A couple of the things I do want to mention before we get started is that we would like for everybody's been muted, but we'd like for your videos also to be turned off, so that way that we can keep everything nice and running smoothly. So just keep that in mind. We do want to actually see where you guys are joining us from. So in the chat box, if you can, as you're joining in, go ahead and type your name and where you're joining us from, as far as your location, because I know that there's been a lot of people that have registered, and we want to kind of have a running total of who all is here and what where they're actually tuning in from, as far as an actual city and state. I know we had several people that registered for some other states too, which is awesome. So a couple of the other things I do want to mention before we get started is that this is kind of a virtual meeting. So it's going to be a little bit different from in person, where you're able to ask questions. So we do want to make you feel comfortable in asking those questions. So if you feel better just typing them in the chat box as we go along throughout tonight's program, you can certainly do that. And we'll get to that when we get to the portion in the program about questions. So if you want to do that, or if you just want to go ahead and unmute yourself and then ask the question that way, you can do that as well too. So I just want you to know that you have a couple of options as you're asking those questions there. So I think that's all the things I have to announce. Again, just to make sure you keep your videos turned off. Everybody's been muted, but if you have questions, you can unmute yourself whenever you do have a question when we get to that part of the program. Glad to have you here. Next is Cindy. She's going to give an update from the Kentucky Hort Council.
Thanks, Kristen. So glad to be here tonight on this rainy evening. I just wanted to quickly say hello and just tell everyone a little bit about the Kentucky Grown Cut Flower Month that we did last month. Well, 2 months now ago in July. So for those of you who participated, thank you very much. For those of you who missed the opportunity, want to make sure that you get some information so you can participate next year. But I just put some images up here for you to see kind of how the month went. So we were able to feature 52 different Kentucky cut flower growers across the social media channels of the Kentucky Horticulture Council. So just put some numbers in there for you. So almost 60,000 reach for the different posts, and engagement of almost 6,000. So we feel like that's a really solid promotional campaign. Reached a lot of people who we haven't engaged with before. So that's very exciting. So lastly here, and I'll put this in the chat too, is we have an impact survey. So for those of you who did participate, you should have gotten an email invitation with this link, but we want to know, like, how did it work for you? And should we do this again? So I'll drop this in the chat. And for those of you who did not participate in Kentucky Grown Cut Flower Month, but would like to in the future, or if you want to be sure that we get you into the database of growers that we're building, go ahead and fill out that survey. And you can just click, I did not participate. But then there's some other information that we wanted to collect to help us. And one of the things is impact from you all, or information from you all, is how we develop these webinars. So any suggestions you have for future content you can put in there, or research needs, all of those can go into the impact survey. So I'm going to stop sharing now, but I'm going to drop that link into the chat. And I want to go ahead and introduce you to Josh Knight, another one of our partners here on the call.
Thanks, Cindy. So like she said, I'm Josh Knight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I've just got a couple of slides. I wanted to talk about some resources that the CCD has for cut flower production. If you've been to any of our prior meetings, you're familiar with this, but I just kind of want to drive it home. And for anybody who's new, if you're going to remember anything about what I say, which this will also be sent out as a PDF for these links, so don't feel like you have to write it down right now, but that the CCD has some cut flower resources and they're all on a page together. We got crop profiles and reference material for a variety of things related to production, as well as different types of production systems. We've also got some irrigation resources depending on what you're using for irrigation, whether it's really low flow rainwater systems or just kind of a survey of different irrigation systems and water use in general. We got some videos. We have some new videos since the last meeting, including 2 virtual farm tours, both of Riverbend Farms and Bel Air Blooms. But the Riverbend's talking about their setup using the CoolBot for post-harvest storage of plants, like a cool space. And Bel Air Blooms talks about harvest techniques. We have more budgets coming soon, but we have some existing ones on Snapdragons. And a map was recently updated of commercial cut flower growers that volunteered into being listed. That's accessible on the same page. It's an interactive map that you can click on these different commercial cut flower growers and get their contact and social media information. So again, that's the link. I'm going to drop that in the chat, and these slides will be sent out to all the registered folks on this meeting. And yeah, so you'll get them then. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. And I don't see Alexis. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kristen if there was something Alexis was supposed to introduce.
Yeah, we're very, very excited to have on the call with us this evening is Dr. William Owen, and he is our new greenhouse extension specialist. We're very glad to have him on board, and he's got some great information that he's going to present tonight to you guys on structures. So Dr. Owen, if there's anything else you'd like to add to your introduction, please do so, but you have the virtual program now.
Thank you, Kristen. I greatly appreciate that introduction. And like Kristen said, my name is Garrett Owen, and I am the new Greenhouse Controlled Environment Extension Assistant Professor in the Department of Horticulture. So the program is split between floriculture, which does encompass floriculture production or cut flower production, and then hydroponic crops. But today I'm going to be talking about something that I'm passionate about, and that's the different growing structures to produce various floricultural crops. So I basically titled this presentation, Growing Structures That Make the Cut. So what would work best for you? So I'm going to present different structures and some research that has been conducted in high tunnels or other structures that may not necessarily be cut flowers, but it lays the foundation of the information that we need to know about trying to grow cut flowers in the various types of structures. So with that, I'm just going to start with just the big picture of cut flower production. So as we are all aware that most, if not all, cut flowers are imported from Central and South America and many other countries in Europe. And that's a lot of the cut flowers that do not really ship well here within the US, but are very popular and often used in bulk arrangements. That being roses, carnations, gerberas, mom, astromerias, or so on. So with that, that's where we come in with the specially cut flowers. And really, what are they? They're the ones that do not ship well or have short post-harvest base life. And that's where we as growers can capitalize and fill these market voids of cut flowers that cannot be shipped from overseas or that can't be stored dry for extended periods of time as they make their way into the US. But here in the United States, the specialty cut flower industry is about $480 million, and it's still expected to increase over the next couple years. So how do we sell these specialty cut flowers? There's different avenues in which they can be sold. What I typically see is farmers markets. I do see some U-Pick or the direct to florist. And that's been more of my experience working with cut flower growers, is direct to florist or farmers markets. But again, there are various avenues in which one can seek to market their cut flowers and be profitable. However, when growing cut flowers, there could be challenges when producing these horticultural commodities. So cut flowers are often field grown, but we have limitations to that production practice in terms of fertility, moisture, pests, disease, and weeds. We really can't control any of this unless we have, say, fertility or irrigation systems in place, or we use plastic mulch to cover these beds. But really, we're at the sake of the environmental factors that, you know, will provide some of this irrigation or the moisture to these crops. But we can't really control pests and diseases all that well. And really, we have no control whatsoever over the light or temperature that our crops are exposed to. So here's an example of a successful cut flower farm in Illinois that's growing everything in field production. However, here's the same farm with their gladiolus bed, and you can see that there is no weed control whatsoever. And this was one of the challenges that this particular grower was seeking. And then this is cut zinnia, and as you can see that this grower was not using raised beds or plastic mulch, but again, if you can see my cursor, but down here at the bottom, this one row, there's just free water standing. So again, no ability to control the amount of moisture that these plants are receiving. And then finally, in terms of this peony cut flower field, is that all these cut flowers were going to come into flower to bloom all at once. But with controlled environments, we can really control and mitigate in terms of all of these flowers coming in at one time. So we can control the flowering and plant development so that you can have succession cuttings and not only have those succession plantings. So to produce these specially cut flowers, or to produce high quality, or to improve the quality of these specialty cut flowers, various structures can be utilized. However, I want to note that these structures do vary by the level of control that they do provide to the production environment. So these systems, of course, we have the open field, and as I mentioned, you know, those are uncontrolled environments. However, the semi-controlled environments are going to be the low tunnels or high tunnels. Low tunnels are often referred to as caterpillar tunnels. And then what we would really consider a specialized controlled environment would be greenhouses. So for today, I'm going to be talking more about low tunnels and high tunnels and the semi-controlled environments that they provide, and also referring back to greenhouses. So what is a caterpillar or low tunnel? Like I had mentioned earlier, this is a semi-controlled environment that basically is a frame structure that is temporary with a single layer of glazing material, which is typically a poly film that allows light transmission through, but also provides protection to the crop. These types of systems, because they are temporary and have a single layer of plastic, really does not have any environmental controls other than protection from, say, rain, sleet, snow, or basically any type of precipitation that may occur. And it can also help with the light transmission. So it could actually reduce the light transmission to the crop and influence stem length and caliper, but we're not going to get into that much at the moment. So as I had mentioned, these low tunnels are very simple structures. I've provided some examples below of some structures I have seen in the United States, and they are typically constructed of what I've seen of T-post or rebar and PVC, and then that single layer of glazing material. I have seen like the row cover material utilized as well, but again, these are just a temporary structure. I would not use these as a permanent structure, but again, the overall goal of these are to provide protection either in late fall or early spring for season extension. So here's an example of a cut flower grower in Ohio that had basically made their own kind of low tunnel, high tunnel like system. But this tunnel here was made out of T-posts and PVC pipe that was stretched out and bent across the crop of these container grown cut lilies. And here's the example of the T-post and just the PVC pipe fittings, very low low cost to produce this type of structure, but yet still able to grow a very high quality and high priced crop under this type of structure. I do want to note that this single layer of glazing material that they do have above these lilies, they did spray a shading compound over the lilies to help protect from that high light intensity. So that is something to note, that if you do want to grow year round under these types of structures, that you may have to provide some type of glazing material or shading material to mitigate any burn or any negative effects from high light intensity or even temperature for that fact as well. And these photos, just for you to know why I mentioned that these photos were taken in July a couple years ago. So what is a high tunnel? It is very similar to a low tunnel, is that it is also a semi-controlled environment, again, with that single layer of glazing material for light transmission. However, I mentioned a single layer. I do see most times in Kentucky a double layer high tunnel, and that it has either spacers in between the two layers of polyfilm, which creates a insulation barrier, just kind of like the insulation in our walls, that air layer provides insulation from the outdoor environmental conditions in the inside. So we can actually keep the inside of those structures warmer without losing any of our internal heat to the outdoor environment. These high tunnels are usually have more controls in a low tunnel, is that they sometimes will have louvers or vents. They'll have doors that can be open or sidewalls that will roll up or down to allow the passive ventilation of the heat that is accumulated in these growing structures. And that can be important, and I'll touch base on this later on in terms of the types of crops that you're growing, that if you do have a lot of heat accumulating in these structures, you can have heat delay. And this is particularly important if you're growing, say, poinsettias or florist moms, but I'm not sure if there's any cut flowers that I'm aware of that may experience heat delay. And then, of course, we have greenhouses, which are controlled environments. They can be covered in various glazing materials, from polycarbonate to films to glass. I will say that these structures, and we probably all know that, or know this, that they are the most expensive to construct. However, the initial cost is expensive, but in terms of the lifelong quality of the structure and plant material that you will obtain from these structures is going to be more beneficial than, say, a high tunnel or low tunnel. But again, they are going to be more costly up front. And then some of the environmental factors that, or controls that we can have in these structures is, artificial lighting for supplemental day extension, heating, cooling, and gas enrichment. But again, it comes down to the budget in terms of which structure works best for you and for your operation. So here's an example of that same cut flower grower that I mentioned earlier, and they have a greenhouse just for their transplant production, and they grow everything else under these high tunnel or low tunnel, caterpillar tunnel like systems in outdoor production areas. So they invested in constructing a greenhouse just for their transplants, but then for all other production areas is just going to be those that are semi to no control. think I got ahead of myself. Yes. So when selecting the appropriate structure for your operation, there are different considerations to think about. But before you select the structure, you need to select the site. So I've listed here 10 different considerations that one should think about in terms of site. So the location, where is it going to be at on your farm? Is it close to a road? Can you easily access it? Is it close to water? Is it close to power? The orientation and the elevation. I'm going to talk about the orientation momentarily, but most structures should be faced north-south to prevent any shading from the end walls. Therefore, you're maximizing the light intensity that your crop is receiving and mitigating any shading that the structures or the end wall will cast onto your plants and basically compromise the quality of the plant material. The solar radiation, is there any trees or any other obstructions that can limit the solar radiation or the light intensity that those crops are receiving? And then the same for the infant structures. Are there any other structures around the greenhouse or high tunnel or low tunnel? And again, that availability of water, the access to roads, and so forth. So these are just the considerations to think about when selecting a site. And then when it comes down to the topography of that location, if you're going to build a structure such as this cut flower grower pictured here, that they had to go in and level and stable the ground, because this, of course, was a very intense expansion of the farm, but also this is going to be something where they were planning to grow in year round, especially during the winter for these cool season crops. And then here's another cut flower grower that had to go in and actually level the ground or raise it to make sure that their greenhouse ranges were adequate. So when leveling, you also have to think about the runoff from these types of structures and where is that going to be collected and diverted so that you don't have washout from your foundations that you have here for your greenhouses or high tunnels. So when selecting a site, that if you need to clear the trees to make sure that that ground is level and that you have addressed that water runoff. And that if you are planting in the ground, you don't need this, but if you care to control the weeds, you may want to consider using a type of covering or ground cover as a weed barrier. I'm going to show some examples of a cut flower grower that did this, actually planted in the ground, but used that weed barrier fabric to help mitigate weeds, but also to help with plant spacing as well. As I mentioned earlier, the orientation of the structure is important. So we always want to face or construct our structures north-south. So this allows for the optimal light transmission into the growing structure and prevents any shading from the end walls. Because the east-west, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. So as the sun moves throughout the day, it's just going to be a continuous casting of a shadow onto your crop. And then we have to think about the elevation. In terms of that is the amount of rainfall. So what is the minimum and maximum rainfall, snow accumulation? So this helps determine what type of structure you actually need to start investigating that will be best for your operation and that can withstand the environmental conditions, the natural environmental conditions that your area often receives, year round. Because this is the last thing that everybody wants to endure, is that you build a new structure, you didn't select the appropriate structure for your location, and you have complete collapse and loss of a growing structure. Or you didn't think about that you needed to secure your poly film as much, and then you have a huge windstorm to come through, and it just removed the whole poly glazing material from your structure. or you didn't secure it enough, and that the wind will come in and just kind of funnel through your tunnel and also cause damage to your crop. So there's some considerations that one needs to think about when selecting one of the sites and thinking about those outdoor environmental conditions and how those will influence the type of structure that you need to select. And then I'm probably going to harp on this the most, is that the solar radiation. So you want to make sure that your crop is receiving the utmost amount of light that you can obtain, so that you can produce the highest quality cut flower crop as possible. And that is important because plant growth and development is influenced by light and temperature. So if you can select a location that allows you to provide the greatest amount of light as possible to the crop without limiting it, that is the most ideal location. But there's other factors that take account or take part into limiting light, and that's going to be the superstructure or the structure of the greenhouse, the high tunnel, or whatever structure it may be, or any obstructions overhead, because the structure itself and even the glazing material can reduce the light intensity inside of a polyglazed material or polyglazed structure by up to 50 or 60%. So just the structure, overhead material, and the glazing material can reduce that light transmission down to the crop. And of course, plant spacing also reduces the light transmission or the effect the light has on the overall quality. However, with cut flowers, we won't stem extension, because usually a stem that is less than 30 centimeters is considered by the USDA a low quality cut flower stem, but this will be species dependent. But if you have lower light levels within these structures, you will have longer stem extension or greater stem extension because of the light quality that plant is receiving, and that's called the shade avoidance response. And that may just be getting into the weeds right now, but again, you want to maximize the solar radiation or the amount of total light that those plants receive. So here's an example of a growing structure that has been oriented east to west, and that you can see that the shadow will move, that this structure is located above 40 degrees north. So that is further north than Lexington, Kentucky is. And that the shadow from the structure will move across the crop over the course of the day as the sun rises and sun sets. Now, if you're below 40 degrees north, you can orient your greenhouse or structure north to south, and that you have the light transmission from the structure itself will just move over the course of the day, and that light will be kind of like a crisscross across the crop. So these are just some considerations to think about the orientation of your structure. And then making sure that these structures, that you have adequate space in between, so that when the sun rises or sun sets, you don't have any shadowing casting upon another structure, which can also limit or reduce the quality of your cut flowers. So when selecting a infant structure, you have to think about the structural components, the size that you're wanting to consider, and the style of house. So there are different styles or different types of structures that one can consider, and I'll go over those momentarily. So again, here's an example of that same cut flower grower that is producing in these semi-controlled environments, these caterpillar low tunnel like structures. But again, you can see the shadowing from the forest line right there, the wood line, casting in on those lilies. So again, those are going to be delayed in terms of flowering, and then B, they're likely going to be lower quality. So they're going to probably have smaller flowers and fewer flowers per stem compared to the flowers that are growing in the center of the house or on the other end that's not being shadowed. And then when selecting those structures, you need to determine if you want a freestanding structure or a gutter connect range. And I have seen both types of systems utilized for cut flower production. So, you know, a freestanding may be best if you're just wanting to monocrop one crop in that house, or you may have a gutter connect and then you just have multiple crops within a house. So what I have pictured here is a high tunnel versus a greenhouse, but I have seen, regardless of the type of control systems, that it could be a unheated gutter connect high tunnel or a heated freestanding greenhouse. So it's really up to you in the terms of how you want to control it. But again, the way you control it and manage it will also ultimately influence the quality of your cut flowers. So as I mentioned earlier, these freestanding houses may be best to create unique environments for different crops or to just monocrop within those structures, but they are typically just a round or square tubing that has been bent and just covered with a single or double layer of polyethylene film. With the gutter connects, you have to also consider about the initial and long-term cost. The initial cost is just like a greenhouse, going to be expensive, but over time, you're going to have less input into that type of system. And then it also provides more support or more strength to the infrastructure itself. So it can withstand higher snow, wind loads. Live load is basically the load in which you have different equipment bearing down or pulling force onto that structure, and then plant load. And I bring that up because this one grower that I have pictured here was trellising sweet peas in the greenhouse. And that was something that we had to consider when she was selecting this greenhouse, is to make sure that the structure itself can support plant material being suspended from the structure itself. And then also it may be worth considering the labor in terms of walking from structure to structure, or the supervision that you need to have from, you know, checking one structure to the other versus just a structure all in one location with multiple bays that you can look at and inspect the crops at one single glance. And then with the freestanding, you typically have limited control in terms of the length of the house and the technologies that you can have in terms of ventilating it. Yes, you can often install exhaust fans or louvers to vent those houses, but again, you have to pull all of that hot air the full length of the freestanding structure, compared to sometimes these gutter connects have these ridge vents that will open up, for example, and you can get all this hot air that has accumulated in these growing structures out of the greenhouse or the high tunnel, for example. And then when considering the type of structure you need or that you're interested in, you can consider a Quonset, an arch, or a Gothic. They typically all range about the same cost. I personally like Gothic and the arch style because I'm a taller individual, but you know, a Quonset style greenhouse or high tunnel, low tunnel will work just fine as well. So here's an example of what a Quonset style is, a traditional hoop style growing structure. This is an arch style greenhouse. And then here we have the Gothic style type structure as well. And then just a comparison of the Gothic versus Quonset style. So again, it really comes down to your budget and other considerations in terms of which style will work best for you and your location. So now that we've talked about the structures itself, it's important to select the appropriate glazing material for these structures. Like I had mentioned previously, they are often covered in a single or double layer of polyethylene film or polyfilm. And these layers are often 4 to 6 millimeters in thickness, or sometimes I'll see 4 millimeters on a double layer. The 4 millimeters, the inside layer, and the 6 millimeter is the outside layer, and then you have the inflation blower blowing the air in between. But regardless, a 4 or 6 mil polyethylene film will work perfectly fine for these types of growing structures, and then these materials will also persist for a couple years without having to reglaze or reskin these types of structures. Furthermore, when it comes to selecting the structure, you have to think about the sidewalls. So with greenhouses, we do often see some fixed or roll-up sidewalls, but it's more on the high tunnel, low tunnel that this is important because there's no fans or louvers really to ventilate those growing areas. So those fixed sidewalls, again, they're fixed. They're not going to roll up, and they're not going to allow for that ventilation or to move that hot air out. However, you do get some crop protection from those sidewalls because they're fixed. Now, the roll up or roll down sidewalls do provide that crop protection, but they don't provide the crop protection when they're up or down. So if you have a windstorm or a heavy rainstorm during the day, you're having to go out and roll them down or up to be able to provide that crop protection. However, these type of sidewalls do allow the ventilation of the growing area. So here's an example of the fixed sidewall. Again, it provides that crop protection, but there's no side ventilation as you would typically see with a roll-off. So again, here's a cut flower grower growing dahlias under protection, but I do want to point out that the end wall is open. But if you had the sidewalls rolling up or down, you would have greater ventilation out of the structure. Heat accumulation in these types of structures is something to think about and to note. However, I do want you to remember that temperature drives plant development, so that if the temperature inside these structures are elevated for a couple days, consecutive days, that you will see those plants start growing faster and developing faster and maybe go to bud or flower faster. I would have to go and check the literature in terms of species specifics, but we do know that plant development is temperature dependent. And then here's these examples of these roll-up sidewalls for this one cut flower grower, basically wanting to ventilate the growing environment for these dahlias. This photo was taken probably in July and August because she also had her shade on top of the house. So that shade was to not to reduce the light transmission, but it was helped to reduce the amount of heat accumulating in those structures. But in turn, applying shade externally is going to reduce the light transmission. But by doing so, again, she's going to result into stem extension in these dahlias. And then again, another example of a cut flower growing using very tall sidewalls to ventilate the growing area. And I mention that because the height of these sidewalls do influence the amount of air in and out of these growing environments and how efficient it is to actually pull and push that hot air out. And then here's another example of a grower growing Lysianthus with these sidewalls. They're not rolling up, but they bunch them up to allow that heat escape. And I do want to note that they applied a shading compound, again, to help mitigate the heat within this growing environment. So these side curtains or these side walls that often roll up are typically manufactured of a heavier woven material that will last longer than the glazing material. However, I have seen some of these sidewalls made of the same glazing material, but again, they can be a pain to replace. But again, that woven material is supposed to last a little bit longer than a typical glazing material because you are rolling these sidewalls up and down, so they do take some wear and tear. So that's why it needs to be a higher or a more durable material. In terms of the sidewalls, they can be opened manually by hand operating a shaft, but I have seen some that are drill or solar operated automatically. So here's an example of a bedding plant grower that would have to go out and crank to the shaft to basically open the sidewalls. And then here's just an automated one that another grower was using to basically open and close these sidewalls. I have seen where these have been connected to thermostats so that if your greenhouse or the growing structure exceeds a certain temperature, that it will open and close to help control the amount of ventilation that they allow, but also to maintain an average daily temperature in that structure itself. However, when utilizing these roll-up side curtains, there can be some challenges, and I have to attest, this is my old research greenhouse that I had previously, and as you can see, I had roll-up side curtains, and this photo was taken on Thanksgiving Day, and we had snow flurries while I was in Michigan on this day. So you can see that the roller got stuck and wouldn't come down, and basically all the heat that I was providing to this growing structure was escaping. So it is important to note that you check on these automated roll-up side curtains to make sure that you don't encounter something like this one day. Not only is there roll-up side curtains, but there are also roll-down side curtains for high tunnels, low tunnels, or even greenhouses. But what I want to mention is that these curtains often collect rainwater and become a breeding ground for mosquitoes or just to grow algae. And they can be easily damaged when anybody is mowing or weed eating very close to these types of structures or this type of side curtain or roll down sidewall. So it's just something to think about when selecting the structure that will work best for you and your operation. So here's an example of a roll down side curtain for a cut flower grower. And then here's another example. So again, the heights of those roll down side curtains again varies. So you just have to determine which will work best for you and your operation and your budget. So as I mentioned, ventilating all that hot air out of the greenhouse because it can be detrimental to the crop. This is a perfect example. This is from Chris Ween at Cornell University, demonstrating the air temperature inside versus outside a high tunnel, and that ventilation is required in this structure. And this is in April in Ithaca, New York. So you can only imagine what the air temperatures would be like here in Kentucky or in your state, wherever you're located, in early spring compared to outdoors without any ventilation whatsoever. And then here's another example. This was a cut flower grower in Ohio. Again, this photo was taken in July. So you can see inside this high tunnel, the temperature was almost 100 degrees. So having ventilation is significantly important when you're thinking about the health of your crop and making sure that you are not exposing it to its maximum temperature, which can be detrimental to its plant development. So this research is from Purdue University back in 2014. And this just demonstrates the air temperature differences of a greenhouse versus a high tunnel in Indiana and also in New York. Although this was with containerized bedding plants, it just shows that, you know, a high tunnel in early spring is going to be significantly cooler than that of a heated greenhouse. And of course, we know that because we're heating a greenhouse. But this just demonstrates that, and at Purdue University in a heated greenhouse in April, it was 66 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas with no heating in a high tunnel, it's 52 degrees Fahrenheit. And then when we look at the average daily light integral, or the amount of light that plants receive in 24 hours, the DLI under high tunnel conditions was significantly higher, almost 2 times higher than that of a heated greenhouse. So you have your trade-offs versus reduced air temperatures but higher light, and how is that going to impact cut flower production? And then here again is another example of research conducted while I was at Purdue University, comparing greenhouse versus a high tunnel versus using floating row covers over containerized bedding plants in a high tunnel. And what I have highlighted here is the average daily temperature, minimum and maximum temperatures over 4 months of bedding plant production. But I would just want to note that, you know, it's about the principle or production practice of using that floating row cover over, using the floating row cover over crops in a high tunnel. It can help trap in essentially some of that extra heat to get these plants through during cool periods of the year. So it may be something to investigate for cut flowers. However, it does take a lot of labor to go out and cover those row covers, or cover those crops and then remove it during certain times of the day. I do want to note that some of the research that I've recently conducted here at the University of Kentucky back in April, looking at growing bedding plants in a high tunnel, is that we did use row covers, and that air temperature underneath those row covers by 9 a.m. exceeded 100 degrees. So that is something to think about in terms of trying to get those row covers removed. And then finally, to be more cut flower related, this is some research that I conducted back in 2016 while at Purdue University. And this was to look at late season cut flower production in a field versus a high tunnel. So our production season was from July to October. And as you can see, that the average temperature of the high tunnel was higher than that of the field. But again, when we look at the deviations, they were very similar. It's just the high tunnel provided more protection, basically a protected environment compared to the field. But when we look at the amount of light that high tunnel reduced, it was significant in terms of the quality of those stems versus what was harvested from the field. And then I'm going to present some of that momentarily. So it's just something to think about in terms of the amount of temperature, the amount of light and the temperatures in those structures. That do you utilize an unheated high tunnel? Do you utilize row covers? And then how much light is reduced in these types of structures, and how does that influence the quality of these cut flowers? And then another consideration to think about when growing in these structures is that, are you going to grow in the soil, or are you going to grow in a soulless media or substrate? So if you are planning to grow in the ground, some of the considerations to think about when selecting the structure is, can you get equipment into these structures to be able to produce beds or to make raised beds? Can you get your irrigation in, and does your trellising system fit within the greenhouse structure or in that high tunnel, so that you're maximizing the amount of growing space that you can have in that structure, and minimizing any wasted space in there, and making sure that you have the ample amount of space to move about between rows. So here's an example of the cut flower grower that I was working with in Michigan, and how she was planting in the ground. and also using the row cover, using ground cover to help mitigate any weeds that was popping up. And also she used it for plant spacing as well. But again, her structure was big enough that she could utilize a tractor within her structure to make sure that she was tilling up the soil in preparation for planting. However, if you're wanting to not plant in the ground, but still plant in soil, you can still consider creating and preparing raised beds within the growing environment. These are these are often permanent, but can be removed. You just have to consider doing a soil test and amending the soil that you utilize for these beds as well. So here's an example of our research high tunnel. We used raised beds and we amended with organic matter every time we went in to transplant because we did not have good fertile soil to plant in straight into the ground. An alternative would be growing in crates. And that is something that I have encountered with cut flower growers that have taken over a field that was constantly sprayed with herbicides and worried that there was still lingering herbicides in the field soil. So they just went into utilizing crates to grow their cut flowers. And again, here's that same cut flower grower in Michigan utilizing crates to grow her cut flowers as well. So she had different systems within one structure to reduce her cut flowers. And again, you can see here with the succession planting of the snapdragons that she was placing in the greenhouse. And I bring that up because this is some work by my colleague while she was at at Purdue University. Even though this is with containerized annual bedding plants, what I want to note is that the media temperature fluctuated from a high tunnel versus outdoor production. And this will also fluctuate that if you're growing in the ground outdoors versus under high tunnel-like conditions, or growing in crates outdoors versus under high tunnel-like conditions, is that you will see differences in media or soil temperature. That's important because soil temperature will limit the availability and uptake of certain nutrients until the soil or substrate temperature has hit the optimal temperature that those nutrients can become available. So it's just something to consider when selecting these types of environments to grow under. And then of course the irrigation, how easily is it to place into the soil or on top of the soil or in the substrate to be able to provide the irrigation that you can essentially manage and control. And again, here using just drip tape across the crates that again can be placed directly into the soil to provide that irrigation nutrient solution to the crop. And then wind protection and support, these fixed sidewalls do provide some protection to the plant, but again, utilizing these types of trellis systems that will provide more support to the crop. We typically see in high tunnels reduced stem extension and thicker stem calipers so that the wind blowing around these structures or through these structures from venting actually causes the stem calipers to become thicker. And that's just a plant physiological process called thigmotrophism. So the shaking of that plant basically reduces the height, but also increases the caliper and makes it a much stronger stem for a cut flower. So it's just something to think about. And I will show some examples of that here shortly. So here's an example of those netting that may be needed for certain species under these types of growing systems. But like I had mentioned, that usually under high tunnel-like conditions, that you can produce higher quality stems compared to those that are grown outside or into fields And that sometimes can be increased or reduced stem length or increased stem caliper. You can have earlier flowering, and that is related to the temperature, as I mentioned earlier, with plant development. And then sometimes larger flowers at the optimal temperature. Now, if you go above the optimal temperature, you will see a detrimental effect, and that will be you'll see smaller, reduced flowers. So what I'm going to do now is just show some examples of some cut flower research that compared high tunnel versus field production while I was at Purdue University. And the first was actually conducted back in 2012, and this is spring production of some select cut flowers being celosia. So you can see here with the high tunnel versus the field that the high tunnel for this type of celosia, this coxcomb-like, that you have shorter stems and smaller flowers, but this is inconsistent with what we found with another type of celosia that I'll show momentarily. Here's an example of stock again. We had a higher quality cut stem of the stock under high tunnel-like conditions versus the field. They were much more compact or shorter, and we had larger stem calipers and basically more flowers coming out of the high tunnel than the field itself. And then with zinnia, the high tunnel yielded more stems compared to the field, and then we had longer stems as well. So, you know, without looking at the text, you can basically see that there is an impact or an environmental impact on the quality of the cut flowers that I have presented thus far. And then with the different types of sunflowers we have presented here. So the high tunnel produced for sun-rich yellow larger flowers in terms of the width of the flower, and the stems were 1.5 inches longer. That may not be that big of a difference for you, but it could be if you have certain parameters that you have to meet if you are, say, selling to a florist. And then for Premier Lemon, time to harvest in a high tunnel was reduced by 8 days. So we were able to harvest 1 week ahead of time compared to the field production flowers. So this is this celosia here, and the subsequent species I'm going to present is the research that I conducted. And this was with the late season cut flower production. So as you can see here, the high tunnel-like celosia had longer stems and thicker calipers under high tunnel versus field conditions. And this was contributed to the low daily light interval that I had presented earlier and that the plants received in the high tunnel compared to the field. With the Lisianthus, the stems were about 6 inches longer and had 8% more flower widths on each cut that we had produced. This was a higher quality Lisianthus compared to the field-grown Lisianthus. And then for the Dianthus, we grew Amazon Neon Cherry and Neon Purple. And again, we had some variation in the high tunnel versus the field. So for example, in the Amazon Neon Cherry, we had almost 200 more stems in that 11 square feet that we produced at. And we started harvesting 10 days ahead of the field. So this is pretty significant when you think about production timing for cut flowers and being able to be ahead in the market. And then with Gomphrena, again, we saw larger flowers and longer stems in the high tunnel versus the field. And then this just demonstrates in terms of time to harvest that under the high tunnel light conditions that we were able to harvest certain species ahead of time compared to those that weren't able to be harvested in the field. But after a certain period of time, there was really no difference in time to harvest of these select species. So there is an opportunity to get ahead and utilize these environments to hit market dates ahead of time, or or be at, say, the farmer's market with celosia when nobody else has it, for example. And then finally, this is just pulling from the research that we also grew some other bedding, or excuse me, other cut flowers that I didn't present here, is that the yellow block indicates a significant difference. So we had significantly more or longer stems, say, of bells of Ireland under the high tunnel light conditions versus the field. And then if it's not highlighted yellow, there was no really significant difference for the late fall production of high tunnel cut flowers. And then the total marketable stems, we did receive, for example, 510 total stems harvested from the high tunnel versus only 238 from the field. And this also varied with Lisianthus, Matricaria, and snapdragons. I do want to indicate that the snapdragons were just a single cut. We did not take succession cuts off those plants, which can be performed, but we typically see the lower quality flowers or inflorescences removed after the primary cut from the snapdragons. So with that, I'm just going to end and say that there are various structures that can be utilized to successfully grow cut flowers. And one just has to think about the initial and long-term investment and the type of structure that you're wanting to produce, and that these structures do vary by the level of control and management that they can provide and that you can allow them to perform. So with that, I am going to acknowledge my colleague and advisor at the time of the Purdue research, Dr. Roberto Lopez, who is at Michigan State University. And then I am throwing up my contact information that if you would like some more information on the information that I presented here, or just my past experience of growing cut flowers in high tunnels versus field versus for research, I'd be more than happy to answer those questions or have a further discussion.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat box. I know we've had one person inquire about some of the meeting material that you presented tonight, Dr. Owen. So if anybody would like the opportunity to ask Dr. Owen any questions, either it be from the presentation or maybe some of his other research that he's done that you had a question about, you feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question. Or if you would rather just type it into the chat box, that's fine too. Dr. Owen, I do have a question real quick. It seems like we've had one question just go in the chat box, but how long was some of that research that you were looking at the different stem lengths and the amount of blooms? How long was that research time period done for?
So for the late season, we had sown the seed in June, and we had transplanted the first or second week of July, and we took the harvest all the way out to the end of October, 1st of November. So it was looking at kind of fall or late season cut flower production. And then for the spring research, they performed, I believe, starting in March all the way until June.
Okay, I was just curious how long that period was, because you could definitely tell a difference with some of the varieties over the others. So that was nice comparisons. And somebody did ask about the handouts. We're going to be sending out everybody that registered. You'll be getting the handouts along with some of the other information that's been presented from tonight. So I just wanted to make sure, as long as, and even the recording will be going out with that as well. Melissa Martin has a question, Dr. Owen. What types of flowers would you start with as a new grower?
So this may actually be a good question for everybody else on the call, but in general, we selected for the research those cut flowers as more of a beginning cut flower for beginning cut flower growers. But you could think about sunflowers, snapdragons, celosia, but also you may want to just consider going to the farmers markets and seeing what everybody else is growing, and then try to differentiate your product mix or the cut flowers that you're planning to grow to be different from them, so that you can basically get into the market and be successful. But again, some of the easier cut flowers to start with, I would say, would be your zinnias, your snaps, sunflowers, or so on. But I'd say anybody else that has more experience growing cut flowers here could probably chime in and give some better advice as well.
Thank you for that. Angie had just commented, thank you so much for all your great information tonight. If anybody has any other questions for Dr. Owen?
So I did see a question by Mackenzie in reference to the shading material going on to the plastic. What do you do in the winter? Then if it shades it in the summer, what did you want the sunlight in the winter? So Mackenzie, if I'm understanding your question correctly, so the only time that you really want to provide exterior or interior shade, or just shade in general, is during summer months, to help mitigate the heat accumulation in the growing structures, or to help reduce the amount of light so that you don't have any detrimental effects on plant growth and development. But throughout the rest of the part of the year, you don't want anything to limit the light transmission into the structure. So you only want to basically have it on during, say, the summer months. So in Kentucky, I would suggest start covering maybe mid to late May, all the way until maybe 1st of September, or maybe June to the end of August. So those are the times that I use energy curtains or shade curtains in the greenhouse for research. It's just during those 3 months.
Yeah, Dr. Owen, there was a question in here about let me get back to it real quick. About, does anyone have any recommendations for a company or group for high tunnel construction? It says, I know the usual sources to purchase, but just looking for somebody or someone to build. I don't know if you have any recommendations there. And then there's another question about, let's see. My little mouse isn't working. Hold on. Okay, there was somebody that had just made a comment about their organization, so I don't think that's really a question, but
Dr.
okay.
Allen, I had a quick question about the Lisianthus. Were those part of the fall study that you did, where you were harvesting the fall, or was that the spring harvest or the spring planting harvest?
The ABC white Lisianthus was part of the fall planting.
So you would have seeded those much earlier than June, but still got them in what did you say, end of July or August?
Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the materials and methods. That was
Sure.
technology. I want to say that they probably sowed maybe early June, but we've transplanted probably 6 weeks afterwards.
Wow.
So that second week of July.
So you didn't see any reduction. I've always heard that Lisianthus likes to start out cooler, and you were doing these, well, you were doing them in a tunnel, right? So they were hotter than even field production. So that's just really interesting, because I know here the saying is always they want to start off really cool. So I just thought that was interesting.
Right. So.
And that's a very specific question. Don't feel like you have to answer it right now. That was something that I've not seen before. So.
Yep. So basically this was our growing environment, that this was July planting field versus high tunnel. And this is what we, you can see in this In the high tunnel, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the bed, see, high tunnel, bottom image, the cut flower bed to the right, or in the center, you have Bells of Ireland, and then right beside it is the Lysianthus, and you can see it growing in the structure. But I will say that we did have some significant pest problems in the high tunnel. We had more caterpillar problems in the high tunnel versus the field, but no problems in terms of getting the crop established.
That's fantastic. I see there's another question here. Will growing in tunnel alter your grow zone? So the example is, if I have a high tunnel, would I be able to plant my ranunculus late fall instead of early spring?
So that's actually a really good question. So tunnels in general, say like a high tunnel will provide you about 10 degrees difference, or it can even be maybe 12. And then using floating row tunnels, you may be able to, floating row cover, you may be able to get even more winter protection or increase the temperature around your crop. So for example, the cut flower grower that I was referencing was actually growing anemones and ranunculus and planting those in November for February or March sales. And that was a very minimal heated greenhouse. I think she heated up to 50 something degrees or 40 degrees just to keep the pipes from freezing. But she was planting in the ground in Michigan, and no problems whatsoever. And the crop quality was very nice. And then she had huge blooms because of the reduced air temperature, and the color was so intensified in these colors because under reduced air temperatures, you have basically more accumulation and expression of these anthocyanin or carotenoid pigments, which make these flowers really awesome at that point in the year. But yeah, so you could significantly get a increase in the amount of temperature in those tunnels to provide some winter protection. So again, 10 to 12 degrees difference that those structures will provide.
Mackenzie just put in the chat box. She said, wow, in Michigan, that's awesome. I'm originally from there. So she was impressed with that one. All right. Does anybody have any other questions for Dr. Owen? I know that y'all have had some great questions so far. I do want to mention, while I've got the program right now, is that we have an evaluation that we would like for you all to complete, especially as joining us tonight for the program. So I'm going to put the registration link in the chat box, and you should be able just to click on that link and go ahead and take that quick survey. It's just something that'll only take you 2 to 3 minutes. And they're really simple questions about what you learned from tonight's program and how you plan to utilize that in the future. And we also are asking for any classes that you would like to see offered in the future as well. So if you all will, please take that survey so that way we can get some feedback from you guys. I'm not seeing anything else. Ann Durbin just said, thank you so much. This was really great and very well presented. I do agree. It was great. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. So Alexis, if you want to let everybody know about our next program, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the next one is in January. Specifically, it's going to be January 24th, same time. You'll register the same way, and it's going to be focused on IPM, but a little bit more specifically, it's going to be early season, almost winter IPM. So we're looking at, okay, you know about these structures now. Hopefully, some of you will be utilizing them, and so these are going to be some of the pests and diseases that you're going to start seeing because you are altering your environment. So integrated pest management with Dr. Larson and Dr. Gauthier, and they are fantastic pathologists and entomologists. So we hope that you will join us on that and keep an eye out. If you have anything else, just let us know.
Perfect. Thanks, Alexis. Thank
Sure.
you guys for joining us, and we hope to have you come back. Thank you, Dr. Owen, again for presenting tonight's program. We really appreciate you, and hope to see everybody again on January the 24th. I know that's a long way away, but it'll be here before you know it. So thank you, guys.